Sometimes the people the world ignores are the ones carrying the heaviest stories. At exactly 6:07 that morning, 28 police cruisers rolled slowly into the narrow apartment complex on the east side of Baltimore, their flashing lights bouncing off cracked windows, rusted stair rails, and rain-soaked pavement like a storm no one saw coming. Curtains twitched open one by one. Phones appeared behind glass. A woman across the courtyard whispered, "Lord have mercy," while recording from her kitchen window. By the time the last cruiser stopped beside Building C, half the neighborhood was awake. Officers stepped out in silence. Dark uniforms lined shoulder to shoulder beneath the pale gray dawn. No sirens, no shouting, just the low hum of engines and the distant cry of seagulls drifting in from the harbor. Upstairs, in apartment 3B, Naomi Carter stood frozen in the middle of her tiny kitchen, holding a chipped coffee mug between both hands. The heat from it barely reached her fingers. Her 7-year-old daughter, Ava, sat at the table coloring on the back of an old grocery receipt when the first knock hit the door downstairs. Heavy. Official. Naomi's stomach dropped instantly. Another knock followed. Then voices. Calm. Serious. Too many voices. Ava looked up slowly. "Mommy." Naomi didn't answer right away. Her eyes moved toward the fogged apartment window where blue and red lights flickered across the peeling walls like reflections underwater. For one terrifying second, her mind raced through every unpaid bill, every parking ticket, every late rent notice folded inside the kitchen drawer. She hadn't done anything wrong. At least she didn't think she had. But poor people learned early that fear didn't always wait for guilt. The knocking grew louder, closer now, boots climbing the metal staircase outside. Naomi set the mug down carefully, though her hand trembled enough for coffee to spill across the counter. Ava slid off her chair and walked quietly toward her mother, wrapping small fingers around the sleeve of her sweatshirt. "Are they here for us?" she whispered. Naomi forced herself to kneel, brushing a loose braid away from Ava's face. "It's okay, baby," she lied softly. "Probably just some mistake." But deep down, something cold had already settled into her chest. Then came the voice from outside the apartment door. "Ms. Naomi Carter?" A pause. "We need to talk to you about the man you fed last night." The words hit harder than any accusation could have. Naomi blinked once. Her throat tightened. Last night. The homeless man beside the broken vending machine near Lexington Avenue. The old man with trembling hands and hollow eyes. The one everyone else walked past like he wasn't even there. Rain had poured steadily after midnight, turning sidewalks slick and silver beneath the streetlights when Naomi finally clocked out from her 12-hour shift at the convenience store. Her back ached. Her sneakers were soaked through. She had exactly $11.40 left in her checking account until Friday. The sandwich in her bag had been meant for breakfast. Half for her, half for Ava before school. But then she saw him sitting there beneath the flickering bus stop light, shoulders curled inward against the cold, staring at the vending machine like he'd forgotten how hunger worked. Most people never even slowed down. A couple crossing the street moved farther away when they noticed him. Someone muttered, "Probably drunk." But Naomi remembered the way his hands shook. Not from addiction, from weakness, from not eating. She had stopped without thinking. "Sir?" she asked carefully. The man lifted tired gray eyes toward her. For a moment, he looked startled that someone had spoken to him at all. "You okay?" she asked. The old man tried to answer, but his voice cracked dry in his throat. "Haven't eaten in about 2 days," he admitted quietly, almost embarrassed by the words. Naomi remembered opening her bag slowly afterward, remembered the smell of turkey and cheese escaping into the cold night air, remembered Ava tugging gently on her sleeve before whispering, "Mommy, we can share cereal tomorrow." And now, less than 8 hours later, nearly 30 police officers stood outside her apartment door. Naomi stood slowly as another knock echoed through the apartment, softer this time, but somehow heavier. Ava stayed pressed against her side, tiny fingers clutching the fabric of her gray sweatshirt, while the red and blue lights outside painted shifting colors across the worn kitchen walls. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee, laundry soap, and the cinnamon candles Naomi only lit on difficult mornings because they reminded her of her grandmother's house in Savannah. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Pale morning sunlight began slipping through the clouds, touching the wet rooftops and puddles below with streaks of silver and gold. Across the courtyard, neighbors stood wrapped in robes and hoodies, whispering from balconies while steam rose from paper coffee cups into the cold April air. Naomi swallowed hard and moved toward the door carefully, each step feeling heavier than the last. Her apartment was small but spotless. The old wooden floors creaked softly beneath her feet, and family photos lined the narrow hallway beside hand-drawn pictures Ava had taped unevenly to the walls. One showed Naomi in a bright yellow dress smiling beneath a crooked blue sun. Another read in messy crayon letters, "My mommy is my hero." Naomi reached the door and hesitated for one final second before unlocking it. The hallway outside fell instantly silent. At least a dozen officers stood along the metal walkway overlooking the courtyard below. More remained beside the cruisers downstairs. Their dark uniforms looked almost black against the brightening morning sky, polished badges reflecting soft flashes of sunlight after the storm. Naomi's breath caught in her chest. Then she noticed something strange. None of them looked angry. None reached for handcuffs. In fact, several officers looked nervous. One older officer near the staircase lowered his eyes respectfully the moment she appeared. Another removed his cap completely. Naomi's confusion deepened. Standing closest to the door was a tall man in his early 40s with deep brown skin, silver strands beginning to show near his temples, and calm eyes that carried the kind of exhaustion only years of responsibility could create. His nameplate read Lieutenant Marcus Reed. Rainwater still darkened the shoulders of his uniform coat. For a brief moment, he simply looked at Naomi quietly, almost as if he had rehearsed what to say and suddenly forgotten all of it. Ava peeked carefully around Naomi's side, her curls messy from sleep. The lieutenant's expression softened immediately when he saw her. "Good morning, ma'am," he said gently. His voice was low and steady, carrying none of the hardness Naomi expected. "I apologize for frightening you." Naomi folded her arms instinctively, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "What is this about?" Marcus glanced behind him toward the officers lining the walkway. Some stared out over the courtyard while others shifted quietly in place. The entire building seemed to hold its breath waiting for the answer. Finally, Marcus looked back at Naomi. "Last night," he said carefully, "you gave food and a blanket to an older gentleman near Lexington Avenue." Naomi blinked once. Beside her, Ava whispered softly, "The man with the tired eyes." Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes, sweetheart. Him." Naomi's pulse quickened again. "Did something happen to him?" she asked. The lieutenant exhaled through his nose, and for the first time his composure cracked slightly. Not anger. Emotion. Real emotion. He reached into his coat pocket and carefully removed something wrapped in clear plastic. A small yellow blanket decorated with faded cartoon stars. Ava gasped quietly beside her mother. "That is mine," she whispered. Marcus held the blanket gently, almost reverently. "He never let go of it," the lieutenant said. Morning sunlight broke fully through the clouds then, flooding the old apartment courtyard in warm gold light, while somewhere below, a church bell rang softly across the city. Naomi stared at the small yellow blanket in Lieutenant Reed's hands as memories from the night before rushed back in fragments of rain, neon light, and cold wind drifting through downtown Baltimore. The blanket had belonged to Ava since preschool. Its edges were worn soft from years of washing, and one tiny corner had been stitched twice by Naomi herself beneath the weak light of their kitchen lamp. Ava stepped forward slowly now, her wide brown eyes fixed on the blanket like she was seeing a missing piece of herself return home. "He kept it?" she asked quietly. Lieutenant Reed nodded once. "All night." His voice carried something deeper now, something heavier than professional duty. Naomi looked past him toward the officers lining the walkway. In the bright morning light, she noticed details she had missed before. Several officers held coffee cups untouched in their hands. One younger woman near the stairs wiped discreetly beneath her eye before straightening again. Another officer stared down into the courtyard with his jaw tight, as though trying to keep his emotions under control. None of them looked like people arriving to punish someone. They looked like people carrying news too important to deliver casually. The breeze shifted through the apartment complex, carrying the clean smell of wet pavement and spring flowers blooming near the chain-link fence beside the parking lot. Somewhere nearby, a radio played soft gospel music from an open window. Naomi wrapped one arm around Ava protectively. "I still do not understand," she admitted carefully. Who was he? Lieutenant Reed lowered his eyes for a moment before answering. His name is Walter Hayes. The name alone changed the atmosphere among the officers. Naomi saw it instantly in their faces. Respect, grief, loyalty. Reed continued quietly. Walter was a detective with Baltimore police for 23 years. Naomi blinked in surprise. A detective? Reed nodded slowly. One of the best this city ever had. For a second, Naomi struggled to connect the broken man beneath the bus stop with the image Reed described. Last night, Walter's coat had been soaked through with rain. His beard had been uneven and gray. His hands shook so badly, he could barely unwrap the sandwich she gave him. But now, hearing his name spoken aloud among rows of silent officers, Naomi realized how easily life could erase someone in the eyes of the world. Reed glanced toward the courtyard before continuing. About 8 months ago, Walter disappeared. His voice softened further. His wife passed away the year before. After that, things became difficult for him. He stopped answering calls, stopped coming around the precinct. Some people thought he left the city entirely. Naomi listened quietly while sunlight reflected off the puddles below like scattered glass. We searched for him, Reed said. A lot of us did. He paused briefly. But Baltimore is a big city. People stopped seeing homeless men after a while. The honesty in his words landed hard. Naomi lowered her gaze. She thought about all the people she passed every day on buses, sidewalks, outside convenience stores. Faces blurred together beneath exhaustion and routine. But last night, something about Walter's eyes had stopped her cold. Not fear, not pity, loneliness, the kind that sat deeper than hunger. Ava looked up at Naomi gently. Mommy said nobody should eat alone. Reed's expression broke then, just slightly. The corners of his mouth trembled before he managed a small smile. Your mother was right. Behind him, one officer quietly cleared his throat and looked away toward the brightening skyline beyond the buildings. Reed carefully folded the yellow blanket once more before extending it toward Ava. When paramedics found Walter this morning, he said softly, this was wrapped around him like it was the most valuable thing he owned. Ava accepted it carefully against her chest, while Naomi felt something shift silently inside the crowded hallway around them. Not fear anymore. Something else. Something warmer. Something human. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The entire apartment walkway remained wrapped in a strange kind of silence, the kind that only comes after fear begins turning into understanding. Naomi leaned lightly against the doorway while Ava held the little yellow blanket close to her chest, pressing her cheek against the faded fabric as if trying to carry some comfort back to the man who had needed it most. Down below, sunlight continued spreading slowly across the courtyard, warming the wet concrete and rusted railings until the entire complex looked softer than it had an hour earlier. The flashing police lights had stopped now. Without them, the morning suddenly felt almost peaceful. Lieutenant Reed glanced toward the officers gathered behind him before speaking again. There is something else you should know, he said quietly. Naomi straightened slightly. Reed reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a folded photograph worn soft around the corners. He handed it to her carefully. Naomi looked down. The picture showed Walter Hayes from years earlier standing beside a patrol car beneath bright summer sunlight. He looked younger then, clean-shaven, proud, broad-shouldered, wearing a detective badge clipped neatly to his belt. Beside him stood a little girl around Ava's age with braided hair and missing front teeth, laughing so hard her eyes were nearly closed. Walter's hand rested gently on her shoulder. Naomi felt her chest tighten unexpectedly. His daughter, she asked softly. Reed nodded once. Emily. The lieutenant paused briefly before continuing. She passed away from leukemia when she was 9. Naomi's eyes lifted slowly from the photograph. Reed looked out across the courtyard as if searching for the right words somewhere beyond the rooftops. After that, Walter changed, he admitted. He still worked, still showed up, but something inside him never healed. A light breeze moved through the hallway, carrying the distant smell of fresh bread from the bakery across the street. Somewhere below, a child laughed near the apartment mailboxes, completely unaware of the quiet heartbreak standing above him. Naomi studied the old photograph again. Suddenly, she understood the way Walter had looked at Ava the night before. Not confusion, recognition, hope. Reed continued softly. Last night, after paramedics brought him in, He kept talking about a little girl with a yellow blanket. Ava looked up shyly. Me? Reed smiled gently. Yes, sweetheart. You. Ava lowered her eyes bashfully while hugging the blanket tighter. Naomi noticed several officers exchange glances behind the lieutenant, emotions flickering quietly across their faces. Reed exhaled slowly before adding, "Do you know what Walter said when they asked why he was crying?" Naomi shook her head. Reed's voice lowered almost to a whisper. He said someone finally looked at him again. The words settled over the hallway like sunlight through stained glass. Naomi looked away for a second, blinking hard against the sudden pressure building behind her eyes. She thought about the hundreds of people who must have passed Walter every day without stopping. The business shoes rushing by him downtown. The commuters staring at phones. The strangers who crossed streets to avoid him. Invisible. That was the word Reed had used earlier. Invisible. Naomi knew that feeling better than most people realized. Working double shifts while customers avoided eye contact. Stretching grocery money through the end of each month. Watching people clutch purses tighter around her on late buses. Some days it felt like the world only noticed people after they disappeared. Reed gently pointed toward the apartment living room behind Naomi. "May we come inside for a few minutes?" he asked respectfully. "There are some people here who would like to thank you properly." Naomi hesitated, glancing at the worn couch, the folded laundry basket near the television, the tiny kitchen barely large enough for two people at once. Embarrassment flickered across her face instinctively. But before she could answer, one older officer near the railing spoke softly for the first time. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave one of ours dignity when the rest of the city forgot how." Naomi looked around at the rows of uniforms standing quietly beneath the warm Baltimore morning light, and for the first time since the knocking began, she no longer felt afraid. Naomi stepped aside slowly, still unsure how a simple act on a rainy sidewalk had somehow brought nearly an entire police department to her door before sunrise. Lieutenant Reed entered first with quiet respect, removing his cap as he crossed into the apartment. One by one, several officers followed behind him while the rest remained outside along the walkway and courtyard below. Their heavy boots softened against the old wooden floors, and suddenly Naomi's tiny apartment felt both crowded and strangely warm at the same time. Sunlight now streamed fully through the kitchen window, spilling across the faded tablecloth Ava had decorated with marker stars months earlier. Dust floated gently in the golden light, while the smell of coffee and cinnamon lingered in the air. Ava hurried to clear crayons from the couch cushions, embarrassed by the mess even though there barely was one. "Sorry," she whispered shyly. A female officer near the doorway smiled softly. "Honey, this place feels more like home than my apartment does." Naomi noticed the woman glance toward the family photos lining the hallway wall. There were not many, just small moments frozen in cheap frames from discount stores. Ava missing her front teeth at age 6. Naomi wearing a graduation cap from community college years earlier before life became too expensive to keep studying. One old picture of Naomi's mother smiling beside a church picnic table beneath bright summer trees. Reed looked around quietly, taking everything in without judgment. The patched curtains. The carefully folded blankets. The stack of overdue bills tucked beneath a fruit bowl, as if hiding them might somehow delay reality. Naomi crossed her arms self-consciously. "I know it is small," she said quietly. Reed looked at her immediately. "No, ma'am," he replied. "It is cared for." The simple kindness in his voice caught her off guard. For years Naomi had grown used to apologizing for things she could not afford. The old car that rattled every morning. The thrift store shoes. The apartment with pipes that clanged at night during winter. But nobody standing in that room seemed to care about any of that. Ava climbed onto the couch beside one of the older officers while clutching the yellow blanket in her lap. The man smiled down at her gently before pulling a silver-wrapped candy from his pocket. "Do not tell my doctor," he whispered with a wink. Ava giggled softly for the first time all morning. The sound changed the room instantly. Tension loosened. Several officers smiled quietly. Outside, neighbors still watched from balconies, but now the atmosphere had shifted from suspicion to curiosity. Reed finally stepped toward Naomi again. "Walter is awake now," he said carefully. Naomi blinked. "He is?" Reed nodded once. "At St. Mary's Hospital." Naomi released a breath she did not realize she had been holding. Is he okay? She asked. Reed hesitated briefly before answering. Physically, yes. But emotionally, he glanced down at the floor. He has been through a lot. Naomi thought back to Walter sitting alone beneath the bus stoplight, while rainwater dripped from the edge of the broken shelter roof beside him. She remembered how carefully he held the sandwich with both hands, almost afraid it might disappear if he blinked too long. Reed reached into his pocket again and unfolded a small piece of paper. The hospital social worker asked if you might visit him later today, he said gently. Naomi looked stunned. Me? Reed smiled faintly. He keeps asking about the woman who treated him like he mattered. Silence settled softly over the apartment again. Not painful silence this time. Something quieter. More human. Ava looked up at her mother with wide, hopeful eyes. Can we go see him? Naomi stared toward the sunlight pouring across the kitchen floor, while emotions twisted unexpectedly inside her chest. Last night she thought she was simply giving away a sandwich. She never imagined she might also be giving someone a reason to come back to life. By late morning, the sky above Baltimore had turned a clear, brilliant blue, the kind that only appeared after heavy spring rain washed every trace of gray from the air. Naomi sat quietly beside the passenger window of Lieutenant Reed's unmarked police SUV, while Ava slept lightly against her shoulder beneath the yellow blanket. Outside, the city rolled past in soft sunlight. Brick row houses glowed warm beneath fresh puddles reflecting the sky. Church bells echoed faintly across downtown, while people filled sidewalks carrying coffees, shopping bags, and umbrellas they no longer needed. Life moved normally everywhere around them. But inside the quiet vehicle, Naomi still felt as though the last 12 hours had rearranged something deep inside her world. Reed drove carefully through traffic, one hand resting loosely on the steering wheel. His police radio crackled occasionally before falling silent again. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then Reed glanced briefly toward Naomi. Walter asked for you the moment he woke up, he said softly. Naomi looked down at her hands folded in her lap. I barely know him. Reed gave a small, thoughtful nod. Sometimes people remember kindness longer than they remember names. The words stayed with her as the hospital came into view ahead. St. Mary's stood tall against the bright sky, its glass windows catching sunlight like mirrors. Flower beds lined the entrance walkway, overflowing with tulips and white lilies still sparkling with rainwater. Nurses and visitors moved in and out through the front doors carrying balloons, coffee trays, and overnight bags while a soft breeze stirred the small American flags planted beside the Veterans Memorial near the parking lot. Reed parked slowly near the emergency entrance before turning toward Naomi and Ava. You do not owe anybody anything today, he said carefully. If this feels overwhelming, you can leave whenever you want. Naomi appreciated that more than he probably realized. So many people in life demanded things from exhausted women without ever asking how they felt first. Ava rubbed her eyes sleepily beside her. Are we really going to see him? She whispered. Naomi brushed her daughter's curls gently behind her ear. Looks like we are. Inside the hospital, everything smelled faintly of antiseptic, fresh coffee, and flowers from the volunteer desk near the lobby windows. Sunlight streamed across polished tile floors while elevators chimed softly in the distance. Several officers standing near the reception area straightened immediately when Reed entered with Naomi. One younger officer smiled warmly at Ava and handed her a sticker shaped like a gold star. Naomi noticed the way people kept glancing toward her quietly, not with suspicion anymore, but respect. The feeling made her uncomfortable in a strange way. She had spent so much of life unnoticed that attention itself felt unfamiliar. Reed guided them gently toward the elevators before speaking quietly again. Walter does not have much family left, he explained. Most of the department became his family over the years. Naomi nodded slowly. She understood loneliness better than most people thought. The elevator doors opened onto the fourth floor with a soft chime. Everything there felt calmer somehow. Large windows overlooked the harbor where sunlight danced across the water beyond the city skyline. Fresh flowers sat beside nearly every doorway, adding bursts of yellow, pink, and lavender to the quiet hallways. Reed stopped outside room 417, but did not open the door immediately. Instead, he stood there silently for a second as though preparing himself emotionally. Naomi noticed his jaw tighten slightly. He has been asking one thing over and over since this morning, Reed admitted softly. Naomi looked at him carefully. What? Reed glanced through the small glass window in the door before answering. He keeps asking why a stranger cared enough to stop. The hallway fell quiet around them. Ava squeezed Naomi's hand gently while sunlight poured through the nearby windows, warming the polished floor beneath their feet. Naomi looked down the bright, peaceful corridor lined with flowers, nurses, and soft morning light, and suddenly she realized something painful about the world. Sometimes people become so starved for kindness that even the smallest act feels impossible to forget. Lieutenant Reed rested his hand gently against the hospital room door before finally pushing it open. Warm afternoon sunlight flooded the room immediately, pouring through tall windows overlooking the Baltimore harbor where boats drifted slowly across sparkling blue water. The space smelled faintly of clean linen and fresh flowers. Someone had placed yellow daisies beside the bed earlier that morning, and their bright colors softened the entire room. Walter Hayes sat propped carefully against white pillows near the window, wearing a pale blue hospital sweater that made him look smaller somehow, more fragile than the man Naomi remembered beneath the rainstorm the night before. But his eyes were different now, clearer, awake. The moment he saw Naomi standing in the doorway beside Ava, emotion crossed his face so suddenly it looked almost painful. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out at first. He simply stared at them like people stare at sunlight after spending too long in darkness. Naomi hesitated near the door. "Hi," she said softly. Walter's throat moved as he swallowed hard. "You came," he whispered. His voice sounded rough from exhaustion, but beneath it lived something warm and deeply human. Ava peeked shyly around Naomi before lifting the yellow blanket slightly. Walter's eyes immediately filled with tears at the sight of it. "You kept me warm," he said quietly to her. Ava smiled gently. "Mommy says blankets work better when people share them." Reed lowered his gaze for a second beside the doorway, visibly emotional. Naomi stepped farther into the room slowly while sunlight painted golden reflections across the polished floor beneath her feet. Up close, she noticed details she missed the night before. Walter's hands were large, but worn with age. A faded wedding ring still circled his finger. Small scars lined his knuckles and wrists, reminders of decades spent working a difficult job in a difficult city. Yet despite everything life had taken from him, kindness still softened his expression whenever he looked at Ava. "I am sorry," Walter said suddenly. Naomi blinked. "Sorry for what?" Walter looked down at the blanket in Ava's hands. "For making you spend your last sandwich on an old man beneath a bus stop." Naomi felt her chest tighten unexpectedly. "How did you know it was my last one?" Walter gave a faint, tired smile. "Because hungry people recognize sacrifice." Silence settled softly through the room after that. Outside the window, sunlight danced across the harbor water while distant gulls drifted through the bright sky. Walter slowly looked toward Naomi again. "I need you to understand something," he said carefully. "Last night, I was not planning to keep going." Naomi's breath caught quietly. Reed shifted uncomfortably near the door, but Walter continued before anyone could interrupt. "Not because I hated life," he explained softly. "Because I thought life stopped seeing me." Naomi looked at him carefully now, understanding the deeper loneliness hiding beneath his tired eyes. Walter glanced toward the harbor window where sunlight reflected across the glass. "When my daughter died," he said quietly, "the world kept moving like nothing happened. Cases still needed solving. Bills still came in the mail. People still laughed at restaurants while my whole world disappeared." His voice trembled slightly before steadying again. "After a while, I stopped feeling visible." Ava slowly climbed onto the chair beside his bed and placed the yellow blanket gently across his lap. Walter looked down at it silently, his hands trembling faintly against the soft fabric. Then Ava said the simplest thing in the world. "I saw you." Walter closed his eyes immediately as tears slipped quietly down his face. Reed turned away toward the window, pretending to study the harbor skyline, while Naomi felt her own eyes burning unexpectedly. In that bright hospital room filled with sunlight, flowers, and silence, something invisible shifted between all of them. Not pity, not charity, something deeper. The quiet reminder that sometimes people survive simply because another human being chooses to truly see them again. The afternoon sun hung low above the Baltimore harbor by the time Naomi and Ava finally stepped back into the hospital hallway. Golden light poured through the massive windows at the end of the corridor, stretching long reflections across the polished floors while nurses moved quietly between rooms carrying flowers, charts, and paper cups of coffee. The entire floor felt softer somehow after visiting Walter, as though kindness itself had changed the atmosphere around them. Ava walked beside her mother, holding Walter's old photograph carefully against her chest, while Lieutenant Reed remained a few steps behind, giving them space. Naomi glanced back once through the small window in Walter's door. He sat near the sunlight with the yellow blanket folded across his lap, staring out at the harbor with an expression she could only describe as peaceful. It was the first time she had seen him look truly at rest. Reed eventually caught up beside her near the elevators. "You did more for him in one night than years of—" "No," he replied softly. "You gave him proof that he still mattered." The elevator doors opened with a gentle chime before any of them spoke again. Downstairs, the hospital lobby had become brighter and busier with afternoon visitors arriving beneath the tall glass entrance. Sunlight streamed through the windows so warmly it turned the marble floors almost gold. Near the front desk, Naomi suddenly noticed a large group of officers gathered quietly beside the Veterans Memorial Wall. More than before, men and women from different precincts, different ages, different uniforms. Some held coffee cups while others stood with hands folded respectfully in front of them. The moment Lieutenant Reed entered the lobby beside Naomi, conversation stopped. Naomi immediately looked down, uncomfortable with so many eyes suddenly turning toward her. She had never liked attention. Life taught her early that invisible people survived easier. But today invisibility no longer seemed possible. Reed guided her gently toward the front entrance where sunlight spilled across the hospital steps outside. Warm spring air drifted through the open doors carrying the scent of flowers and fresh rain. Then something unexpected happened. One by one, every officer standing near the entrance slowly straightened into formation. Naomi froze in confusion. Ava squeezed her hand tighter. The sound of shoes against marble echoed softly through the bright lobby until complete silence settled across the room. Lieutenant Reed stepped forward first. He removed his cap slowly, holding it over his heart before speaking in a calm, steady voice that carried through the entire entrance hall. "Most people looked past Walter Hayes these past 8 months," he said quietly. "Most people saw a homeless man sitting beneath bus stops and sleeping beside sidewalks." Reed turned toward Naomi fully now. "You saw a human being." The silence afterward felt enormous. Naomi's eyes widened slightly as officer after officer removed their caps too. Some lowered their heads. Others smiled through visible emotion. One older officer near the back wiped tears quietly from beneath his glasses before standing straighter again. Reed continued softly. "Walter trained half the detectives in this city. He spent decades protecting strangers he never even met." His voice thickened slightly before steadying again. "Last night, when he needed kindness himself, a woman with almost nothing still chose to stop." Naomi felt emotion rise suddenly in her chest, so powerfully she could barely breathe around it. Ava looked up at her mother with shining eyes filled with pride. Then, without command or announcement, every officer in the lobby raised their right hands in salute toward Naomi. The gesture was simple, silent, genuine. Sunlight poured through the hospital windows behind them, surrounding the entire room in warm gold, while Naomi stood completely still beneath it, overwhelmed by the realization that one small act of compassion had somehow reached farther than she ever imagined possible. The sun was beginning to set over Baltimore by the time Naomi and Ava returned home. Warm orange light stretched across the city skyline, turning windows into sheets of gold, while soft spring air drifted through the streets, carrying the smell of rain-soaked pavement and blooming flowers. The apartment complex looked different now somehow. Gentler, kinder. A few neighbors stood outside talking quietly near the mailboxes when Lieutenant Reed's SUV pulled into the parking lot. But this time nobody stared with suspicion. Instead, people smiled softly as Naomi stepped out holding Ava's hand. One elderly woman from Building A placed her hand over her heart and nodded with quiet respect. Another neighbor who had barely spoken to Naomi in 2 years offered a warm hello for the very first time. Naomi was not used to any of it. She still moved carefully through life the way exhausted people do, expecting kindness to disappear the moment they reached for it. Reed walked them upstairs carrying a small paper bag from the hospital cafeteria, filled with cookies Ava insisted Walter would have wanted them to keep. The hallway glowed with soft evening light pouring through cracked stairwell windows, while distant music floated upward from someone grilling downstairs in the courtyard. When Naomi reached apartment 3B, she paused in surprise. Several grocery bags sat neatly beside her front door. Fresh bread, milk, eggs, fruit. A bouquet of yellow daisies rested carefully on top beside a folded white envelope with her name written across the front in neat handwriting. Naomi looked back immediately. Who did this? Reed smiled faintly, but said nothing. Ava dropped to her knees beside the bags, eyes wide with excitement. Mommy, she whispered, lifting a carton of strawberries carefully like treasure. Naomi slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note on thick cream-colored paper. Her eyes moved across the words silently at first. Then her breathing caught. Reed watched quietly while evening sunlight wrapped the narrow hallway in warm gold around them. Finally, Naomi looked up again, emotion shining visibly in her eyes. What is it? Ava asked softly. Naomi swallowed hard before reading aloud. Dear Naomi Carter, 30 years ago, Walter Hayes helped save my life during my first week as a rookie officer. Yesterday, you helped save his. Some debts can never truly be repaid, but kindness deserves kindness in return. Naomi paused briefly as her voice trembled. Beneath the message sat dozens of signatures from officers across the city. At the bottom, someone had added one final handwritten line. Thank you for seeing the human first. Silence settled softly through the hallway afterward. Not empty silence. Peaceful silence. Ava leaned gently against her mother while Reed stared out through the stairwell window toward the glowing city skyline beyond the rooftops. Walter asked me to give you something else, Reed said quietly after a moment. He reached into his coat pocket and removed a small silver detective badge worn smooth around the edges from years of use. The metal caught the evening light beautifully. Naomi's eyes widened immediately. I cannot take that. Reed shook his head gently. He insisted. Naomi accepted the badge carefully into her palm. It felt heavier than she expected. Not because of the metal, because of everything it represented. Years of service, loss, survival, humanity. Ava touched the badge softly with one finger before smiling up at her mother. You helped a hero, she whispered. Naomi looked down at her daughter for a long moment. Then she glanced toward the warm apartment waiting behind them, the groceries beside the door, the flowers glowing beneath sunset light, and finally toward the old badge resting quietly in her hand. Somewhere deep inside her chest, something tired finally loosened. Not because life suddenly became easy, not because money problems disappeared or pain vanished overnight, but because for the first time in a very long while, the world no longer felt quite so cold. And as the sun slipped lower beyond the Baltimore skyline, Naomi Carter stood silently in the golden light, holding a detective's badge in one hand and her daughter's fingers in the other, while the city around her kept breathing softly into the night.